If you try to understand communications and culture and intercultural communications, you'll find yourself reading books from all kind of diverse disciplines, as funny as neuroscience and criminology. However, in order to compare those findings, one could really use some sort of unifying language, some meta-science, something to describe what you found so you can compare it and complement it. Take, for example, physics or chemistry. They both use mathematics to describe and analyze nature. It would be rather hard to do either one of them without using math, wouldn't it? Mathematics, in a way, is such a meta-science for these disciplines. In the last century, something like a meta-science emerged for the whole area of cultural studies, which in a way is a little ironic because anthropology actually had started out to deal with this whole thing called culture and then started splitting into different departments, like for example material anthropology and social anthropology and cultural anthropology. Now I'd like to introduce this new sort of science, this meta-science, which is commonly known as semiotics or semiology. We'll first start off with briefly mentioning its two founding fathers and the different traditions they're responsible for. I'll introduce basic concepts of semiotics and proceed by trying to explain why I think that it's worth your time to ponder what semiotics has to offer. Let's start with Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure was born 1857 in Switzerland. He had a huge impact on the development of linguistics in the 20th century and is even considered by some as the father of modern linguistics. Saussure, however, is also very important in semiotics or semiology. That's how he used to call it. Actually, he never produced anything written about semiology. It was a science which didn't exist, yet but which he envisioned should exist and would be very useful. And so he started dreaming about it in his lectures of the course in General Linguistics in Geneva. Some of his students found that stuff so exciting that after his death, which occurred in 1913, they published their inklings in the year of 1916 as a book. The word semiotics, or semiology, comes from the Greek word semeion, which means sign. A sign is commonly understood as being something which stands for or points to something else. Semiotics, then, would be the science of signs, sign systems, and sign processes. Saussure's approach is very language-centered, which is not surprising for a linguist, is it? The basic idea was that there is a signifier and a signified. The signifier is the word, and the signified is the concept. When we say word, we don't necessarily mean the sound you hear, but the sound image in your brain. So what he was talking about are two psychological entities which are joined by our brain into one sign. So whenever I say tree, you immediately think about those things which grow out of the ground and have green stuff hanging off their extensions. The anthropologist Levi Brühl called this phenomenon participation. The signifier and the signified become so much one that we don't even realize that they are two sometimes. Actually, this ability of the brain to join two disparate things, two phenomena or two patterns together and treat them as one is an incredible ability. In a way, this is the core of the operating system of our human brain. Without this ability, we wouldn't have a culture or language. Basically what happens is that your brain perceives certain patterns and its environment. Let's say as a baby you see an apple. If you've ever watched babies, you know how eager they are to make acquaintance with anything new to them. They will touch it, they will smell it, they will lick it, they will try to bite it or eat it. While they do so, their brain creates a mental representation. The mother's baby keeps telling the baby that this thing is an apple and keeps repeating that input until the baby's brain creates another mental representation, this time a sound image of apple. Because these two patterns tend to occur together, meaning every time there's an apple, the mother will say apple. The baby's brain starts connecting these two mental representations. Saussure would say, see, there's your signifier and your signified. From now on, every time you see an apple or somebody describes an apple, the word apple comes up in your mind automatically. And of course, every time somebody mentions apple, the concept of an apple is simultaneously activated. The beauty of it is that the two things become virtually one. Before long, you take the representation for the real thing. We say that the sign becomes invisible, transparent. You're not aware that you are actually living with representations. That is science. To make the importance of this thought even clearer, I'd like to engage in a little mathematical demonstration about your neurons and synapses in your brain. Neurons have up to 10,000 synapses, connecting them throughout the brain with other neurons. All the impulses flow through these synapses from one neuron to another. The number of neurons is estimated somewhere between 10 to 200 billion, and the number of synapses, that's what the real meat is, somewhere around 1,000 trillion. Let's take a very conservative number and say we've got only 100 trillion synapses in the brain. Of course, there are also impulses coming into our brain from the outside, from all over the body, from all kinds of nerve cells. By far the biggest chunk comes from our eyes, roughly 6 million. It's safe to assume that the total number of connections between the outside world, which is body and everything we perceive, and the brain is below 10 million. Only 10 million synapses are connected to the outside world. With other words, only 10 million over 100 trillion, which is 1 over 10 million of your brain, is actually connected to the outside world. That is 0.00001%. It's safe to say that we actually live inside our brains. By the age of 14 or so, we've created a copy of the outside world in our brain, including language, culture, and worldview and everything. Maybe you can see now the incredible importance of understanding the semiotic nature of our human mind. Let's get back to Saussure. Of all the interesting thoughts from his work, two things seem noteworthy at this stage. Firstly, signs are arbitrary. Basically, Saussure was saying that there's no reason why a dog should be called dog and not Hund, chien, Bess, or Kelb. Signs are totally arbitrary. He would say that they are not motivated. Of course, once we have agreed that Hund is a dog, then they are not arbitrary anymore, but rest on a convention. But before, it's totally random. Secondly, signs are purely psychological. That is, a referent from the real world out there is not part of Saussure's definition. In a way, signs define each other and are not defined by something outside the sign system. Where one sign ends, the other starts. Almost like a map, where a line is the border between two countries. If it's not France, then it's Germany. Well, if the Germans don't want it, it would be France. This led to a strong focus on structures, because at the end of the day, at least in the thinking of structuralists like Lévi-Strauss, structures were the essential thing which gave meaning. Also at the end of the 19th century, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, was a guy called Charles Sanders Peirce, born 1839. He was an incredibly smart but a little eccentric young fellow who at the age of 12 read one of his oldest brother's copy of Richard Whately's Elements of Logic. With other words, not your regular Joe. He was trained as a chemist, but really became known for his contributions to logic, mathematics, philosophy, scientific methodology, and his founding role in semiotics and pragmatism. He approached the subject from a more philosophical side and designed a different concept of science. He proposed to use a triangle as the starting point. There's a representamen, the sign vehicle, which Saussure called signifier, the object, which is the object the sign refers to, some call it the referent, and the interpretant, which is not the interpreter, but rather the effect the sign has in the mind of the interpreter. Roughly speaking, the equivalent to Saussure's signified. As you can see, Peirce is anchoring his concept in the real world out there. He also takes a different route when it comes to the question of motivation of science than Saussure did. Peirce suggests that there are different modes of science. Some science, he agrees, are quite unmotivated and very arbitrary, and calls this kind of science symbols. The symbol does not resemble the signified, which is fundamentally arbitrary or purely conventional, so that the relationship must be learned. For example, language in general, numbers, Morse code, traffic lights, national flags. However, some signifiers have a different relationship to their signified. Icons are perceived as resembling or imitating the signified, recognizably looking, sounding, feeling, tasting, or smelling like it, being similar in possessing some of its qualities. For example, a portrait, a cartoon, a scale bottle, metaphors, sound effects in radio drama, a dubbed film, soundtrack, imitative gestures. A third mode of science is the index. This signifier is not arbitrary, but is directly connected in some way, physically or causally, to the signified. This link can be observed or inferred. For example, natural science like smoke, thunder, footprints, echoes, non-synthetic odors and flavors, or medical symptoms like pain, a rash, the pulse rate, or recordings, a photograph, a film, video, a television shot, an audio recorded voice. The question, of course, remains if an icon or an index doesn't have at least to some degree also an arbitrary side to them. And Peirce would readily admit that there are probably no signs in a pure mode out there. As you can easily see, this concept of science goes beyond linguistic phenomena. And semioticians ever since have been debating if we should consider only conventional science according to Saussure as the object of semiotics, or any kind of science according to Peirce. The semiotician we will follow in our little presentation here, a German chap called Posner, sees great value for our cultural studies to take the broad approach, and I tend to agree with him. Semiotically speaking, all of our knowledge, understanding, skills and attitudes, our whole human universe, is a big network of science systems. When it comes to epistemology, that is the whole question of how we come to know and understand anything, we have to make everything into science, otherwise we can't work with it. Some speak of the symbolic world we live in. Yuri Lotman introduced the concept Semiosphere as the totality of all science systems. It might be helpful to start out with a couple examples of science processes and use them to introduce basic concepts. Let's say you see smoke in the neighborhood, which makes you an interpreter or recipient. You would take the smoke as a sign, with Peircean terminology as an index for a fire. The fire would be in this case the referent. You come to an assumption, which we call interpretant, that is the effect of the sign on your mind, that there's a fire burning nearby, which would be the message. This sign could occur just by itself, without a sender. The sign only indicates that there's a fire. Nobody's doing any indicating. However, in some cases one could use a fire to send a message. For example, in the history, military commanders used to lit a fire at the peak of a mountain to indicate to their scattered troops that the battle was won. The sign would mean victory. To receive the message, we have won the battle, one would need to be familiar with this code. A code connects at least two things, in our case fire and victory, and makes it possible for humans to communicate more effectively. The same commander would have shouted "Fire!" during the battle. Again, if you didn't speak his language, that is, share the same linguistic code, you wouldn't know what he means. However, through a highly complex inference process, you would know that he is not referring to a fire nearby, but rather that he is commanding you to shoot. In this case, the commander would be the sender, and the soldiers he's addressing with his command would be the addressees. Sometimes, however, we want to reach recipients without them believing that we wanted to reach them. These we call bystanders, and then there might be people we are not even aware of. They would constitute the group of other recipients. All these recipients are sign users. In these examples, there are different sign processes. There is a codeless indication, and there is coded indicating. Let's pursue this difference a little further. Imagine you're driving a car and arrive on one of the circles of Amman. You might have noticed that if you decided to wait to get the circle until somebody stops to let you in, you might end up spending a whole afternoon watching the others. Therefore, you'll start pushing your way into the traffic with little movements indicating that you're about to enter the circle. This behavior doesn't use any code. It is purely physical indication. As you're waiting your turn, you realize that there's scattered glass with a red and orange color on the ground. Immediately you deduct that there was an accident earlier this day on this spot. In order to know that, you need to be acquainted with a certain code, namely that cars have orange lights on their corners, using them as indicators. If you hadn't seen a car before, maybe not even a street, and how traffic works, you wouldn't be able to come to that conclusion. This process goes beyond indication because of the fact that there's a code involved in it. And therefore we call it signification. So while you're standing there, you might decide to make eye contact with one of the other drivers and use a gesture to communicate with him. Probably you would make the CIEE sign, and this way using a code. In the first case, pushing your way slowly into the circle, you are trying to communicate through indication without a code. Now you're communicating through signification using a code. Posen depicts these three different concepts, indication, signification, and communication, with this diagram. On the left side, on the circle, you would find any sort of indication. These are sign processes which do not use or require code, like the smoke referring to a fire nearby, or you're pushing your way through the circle. On the right side, you'll find sign processes which do require some sort of code in order to be successful. Indication and signification can take place without a sender. In our example above, the scattered glass wasn't left there by anybody to send a message. However, we can use both indication and signification to send a message to recipients. Hence, communication can use codeless indication and signification to convey messages. If there's no sender, however, there's no communication. Semiotics offers a great way out of the limitations of different sciences like, for example, communications, or departments of sciences like social, material, and cultural anthropology. It puts the findings of these sciences into a bigger framework and relates them to each other. Social anthropology concerns itself with the social culture, which we call society. Each society consists of institutions and rituals performed by them. Examples include religious institutions such as a Christian church and the rituals of the church service. The subject area of material anthropology is the material culture of society, that is, its civilization. The civilization of a society consists of artifacts and the skills of producing and using them. Examples of artifacts used in religious institutions are crosses, rosaries, hymnals, and Bibles. The subject area of cultural anthropology is the mental culture of society, insofar as it is manifested in its civilization, that is, its mentality. The mentality of society consists of mantifacts, that is, the ideas and values and the conventions governing their use and expression. Examples of religious mantifacts are the Catholic saints and their emblems, the classification of sins with the corresponding terminology like mortal and venial sin, and so on, and the gestural codes of priests. These things can be studied separately, however through semiotics they can be easily related to each other. A culture as a science system consists of sign users, which is the society, who use codes, which we call mentality, to produce and interpret artifacts, which is the civilization. Here are some questions we will be asking in the class. What happens when sign users enter a different culture? What happens when artifacts, institutions, or mantifacts are introduced in other cultures? Is Watzlawick's first axiom valid? One cannot not communicate.